The show is about what rights we have, both men and women, when it comes to our bodies. And today, I'm hoping that we're going to shed some light on something I said in the show and had no idea that while I was saying it in the show, that there was actually an author out there, that there was somebody speaking out about circumcision. And one of the things that I brought up was, is there anything about this that makes any sense for how we can explain that? And today, Anthony Losquadro is joining me here today. We're going to talk about that because one of the things that came across my desk, believe it or not, was an article, more importantly, was information that talked directly about what I said. Now, I must say that at the time when I said it, I did not know that there were people like Anthony out there that were literally not just looking at what this is about, but we're studying the effects, that we're talking about how circumcision damages your mental health. And so there is the body of work that Anthony has put together, Anthony Losquadro has put together, where, he's talking about the psychological effects on infants, adolescents, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So for those of you that sent me all of those emails talking to me that I was saying something that wasn't true or talking about something that didn't exist, I want to say that God's spirit universe has a very interesting way of operating. And lo and behold, a week after Megan and I talked about this, because we are not experts in this, this comes across my desk. For those of you out there, let me just tell you, Anthony is the founder and director of Intaction. He is the founder and organization of an effort to give children a voice over their body autonomy, right? And to raise awareness on the importance of an intact body. So when we're talking about Intaction, we're talking about an intact body. He is out in front. And what he says is, once I understood what our society did to babies, I knew this had to be stopped. And so he has spoken before the Commonwealth of Massachusetts State Senate Joint Committee about circumcision legislation, and he has presented information, maximum impact. And so today, believe it or not, unbeknownst to me or Megan Edge at the time, there was somebody that took this on. And what does it mean to take it on? What does it mean when you have someone like Anthony who steps out and says, wait a minute, there's something going on here that absolutely is a giant disconnect. And it ties right in to what we're saying. And what it means is that today on the show, we're going to hear from his perspective. And it's not a mistake that Megan and I were talking about this, and then across my desk comes a press release of someone out there, Anthony Losquadro, talking about this and what the psychological effects are on infants, adolescents, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Anthony, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for speaking with me today, Dr. Pat.
Look, Megan and I made a comment on a show 2 weeks ago, and we challenged the question, that what happens to our bodies is not just a question for women. Today's show really gets at something that's directly affects men. And in our interview, we brought up circumcision because it's not an area we know about, but you do. Your article and the research and the work you've done literally points out 7 ways that circumcision damages mental health. Let's start that conversation. What is it about this topic that got your attention?
Well, there's so much about this. My job is a little bit unusual because it's telling people that having foreskin as a male, it's normal. It's a natural body part. And this is something that the rest of the world doesn't do. It's really just America and some religious people with religious backgrounds, but for the most part, most of the world doesn't do this. And as I was a child, I went to Italy. I went to Florence, Italy, and I saw some of the statues and sculptures, and they were all intact. And I started to wonder, why were their penises different from Americans' penises?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that would make sense. That would be something that you would think about. But you wouldn't think about the next question that goes with that. And that's kind of like, what the heck's going on? Because we're not talking, look, I come from an Italian family, and one of the things that happens at least it did once upon a time in an Italian family, is we all got our ears pierced, right? So that was a thing. That's like you're an infant and you get your ears pierced. But this, how many people have actually questioned this act, the act of circumcision?
Well, it's really, as I said before, it's an American phenomena that started about 100 years ago, because back then Americans were obsessed about stopping masturbation in boys. So they thought by removing the foreskin, they would remove some of the sensitivity and inhibit that practice. And there was celebrity doctors of the time, like Dr. Kellogg, that was an advocate of this practice. And it kind of caught on, and it became a business, and it became a money-making business for American doctors. So now, later on, as people have access to information, here we are in 2019, people are really starting to question this and saying this isn't necessary. Over 22 medical associations around the world specifically say, do not circumcise baby boys. Foreskin is there for a reason. It has what we call the 4 powers. It provides pleasure, protection, lubrication, and connection. Nature put it on our bodies for a reason. So people are questioning this, and the impact it has on a male. For those that are able to recognize that, they can be very unhappy about what was done to them.
Mm-hmm. And let's break it down into the terms that you cite, because I think when I think about this, I go into a moment of shock. Let's talk about the effects that you reference, right? The damages. Let's talk about pain. We now have studies across the board, and it doesn't matter what culture you're talking about, it doesn't matter where you are, but we now know that pain to infants, right? Not just emotional, but physical pain to infants has a huge effect in the area of brain research. Tell us about the pain factor.
You're absolutely right, Dr. Pat. A lot of Americans like to brush off the pain issue because they feel babies can't remember it, so therefore it has no impact. And what people have to understand is that just because a child can't remember something, that doesn't mean it doesn't affect him. The pain and trauma done to babies during circumcision has been associated to changes in the brain, and particularly the hippocampus, which is the area that controls memory and emotion, and other functions crucial for development and cognitive function. There were studies done by Vanderbilt University, American Academy of Pediatrics, and traumatic pain has a significant impact on babies. So
this is like one of those things that you go to school for like a bunch of years, right? And you go to school because we have to go to school or we have to educate ourselves. And the common sense parts of us say, yeah, if you inflict pain on an infant, it's going to have short-term, but does it have any long-term results? Let's jump to a conversation about a longer-term result, because we're going to drill down in each of these, okay? But the thing that we don't realize is the damage can have lasting effects. First of all, psychological effects. PTSD, that is something that happens and it has longer term effects. Is this what you're, pointing to in this particular circumstance for these infants?
PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, is definitely caused by circumcision. And that's just one of the things. And some of your listeners might be saying, well, the doctors give my son anesthesia, so he didn't feel anything, or he slept through it. And people have to understand that babies are not given effective anesthesia because they cannot tolerate it. Doctors may put some ointment on it called an Emla cream. And if I was to put some of that cream on your arm and then stick you with a needle, you would hit the ceiling. So there's no effective pain management for babies undergoing circumcision. Babies feel this; they feel every bit of it. And if they think that the baby's sleeping through it, he's not sleeping through it. He's in a state of shock. I had a neurodiagnostic technician from Cedars-Sinai call and tell me that oftentimes babies, directly after circumcision, doctors would be in a panic because it seemed like the babies were going into a seizure, and they would do brainwave studies on the baby. And they didn't find any abnormalities, but they were having a seizure or seizure-like effect from the pain of circumcision, and that could be erratic breathing, their eyes rolling back in their head. Baby's captive. He can't move. He's tied down and strapped down in this contraption while they cut off and crush part of his genitals, and they go into shock sometimes. That's some of the effects of the pain that they have to endure, sometimes only a day old.
You know, Anthony, I'm touching upon one thing, right? The pain. Let's talk about the psychological consequences, right? Because we now have a body of work for men's studies, right, of men who were circumcised in infancy. And, I was a little bit surprised, I must say, but then not surprised. Let's talk about some of that research and what we now know about the psychological consequences for adult men.
Well, there's a couple things. There's the psychological consequences, and then I think, a young man growing up, he sees a scar on his penis that nobody talks about. And some guys can take that as a betrayal, that part of their body was removed because their parents thought it was good enough for them, and they were not the child was not in a position to object or say, I don't want this. And it was done to them because the parents could. I think young people, a young male growing up, could feel like he was betrayed because his parents didn't protect him. There's also another issue. You hear a lot of today about Me Too and toxic masculinity. Mm-hmm. And how do we expect young men, or just men in general, how do we expect them to respect a woman's body and a woman's space when their own body and their own space and their own autonomy was not protected or given any consideration when they were just a few days or maybe even a few hours old?
Yeah, I think that's a very pointed question, because we can expect to understand something, but to empathize with it is way different. And that's really what you're talking about. One of the things I was struck by in the work that you're doing is looking at where we are, in those years in between, right? Where we are with where the CDC operates from all of this, especially when we're looking at, children, adolescents, right? And some of these medical procedures that are often experienced and traumatic. Give us an idea of the range of what we're talking about here.
So are we talking about later on in life? Or?
Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting study that was published in the Journal of Men's Health, and they found that males exposed to circumcision trauma had higher rates of personality trait disorder, in which they had difficulty identifying and expressing their feelings. The technical name for that is called alexithymia. You don't have to know that, but there has been studies shown that men have been subjected to the circumcision trauma. Later on in life, it affects them. Look, there are young men that have committed suicide over this because they either couldn't come to grips with it, or the surgery was botched and they felt that they could never be normal again, or they could not engage in a normal relationship. And they would rather end their life than have to deal with this, or they couldn't handle the feelings of betrayal they had from their parents. I had a personal friend that committed suicide over this issue. And so people tend to think, well, it's a penis, let's make jokes about it, or why don't you have something better to do with your time than work on this issue? And they say that callously, but people don't understand how much this can affect a man later on in life.
Yeah. We're going to take a short break, Anthony. And when we come back, one of the things I really want to explore with you, and I'll make sure people have lots of information, is, we're talking about this almost as if the harm that's done is marginal. When we come back, I want to go into something you said, the significant psychological effects, the effects that would have someone take their own life, right? And I think you talked about it in 3 ways. So I hope you'll stay for one more segment, if you don't mind. And I want to talk about the full scope of physical, mental, emotional pain, and talk about why, if we know all this, is it so hard to do anything about it? Let's take a short break, everybody. Anthony, before we go to break, what's the best website people can go to find out about you?
Our website is intaction.org, intaction.org. We're also on Facebook, and we also have a YouTube channel.
Awesome. Anthony Losquadro, when we come back, we're going to be talking about, putting this all together. What does it mean? Hey, everybody. Great to have you tuning us in, turning us on here on Power Up Radio. This is a follow-up to a conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago on the show. And at that time, didn't really have the kind of information that we're sharing with you today. Anthony, thank you for coming on. This is more than just information to you. This is your life's work. So thank you for that. And we also gave out the website for people to be, get engaged. I wanted to take a minute and kind of bring this all together and have you talk about the complete effects of circumcision or, this particular action or actions like this for an infant has wide range and lasting effects. But yet we're talking about kind of almost like something that government agencies like the CDC says, it's okay, just follow the guidelines. Give us an education on this.
We have to understand agencies like the CDC, they tend to want to protect the status quo, and they help perpetuate some of the myths that circumcision has medical benefits. When none of the European medical associations believe in that. You have agencies like the American Academy of Pediatrics, which hold themselves out as experts in the area of health care for children. But what they really end up being, once you pull back the curtain, is they're a lobbying association for doctors and to make sure that insurance reimbursements are maintained. So you got to be a little bit careful where you're getting your information from. And where my information comes from is common sense. And nature put our foreskin on men's bodies, and incidentally, women have foreskin too in the form of clitoral hood. It put it on our bodies for a reason, and it became this cultural practice to cut it off. And it's just one of the strangest things.
It's the strangest things, but for some religions, it's a necessity. And so what kind of backlash do you get from that? You and I were talking during the break, and I was sharing a story that, for me, I have or had a friend, and what she went through with literally castration of sorts, right, due to a religious issue, requirement, whatever you want to call it. For somebody like me, I'm in shock. But as an infant, you basically don't have a voice at all. Where do you see us making progress here? And what do we need to do to educate people about this?
Well, people just need information. And that's one of the things our organization does. We run public events where we engage people in face-to-face discussions, and we hand out literature, and we give them an opportunity to ask these questions. And generally, we find once they get the information, they say, you know what, what you're saying makes sense, and cutting off body parts doesn't make sense. You know, when it comes to religion, male circumcision is required by, like, for instance, Judaism and Islam. Yeah. But what some people of the Jewish faith are doing now is there's a new ritual called Brit Shalom, in which they welcome the baby, and they have the ceremony. They do everything the same, except they don't cut off any body parts. And they recognize that, you know what, this is an antiquated practice, and just because it was done 1,000 years ago, we're not going to follow that anymore. But we could still be Jewish. We could still be who we are. So there's a number of Jewish people, and incidentally, half of our board of directors are either Jewish or of Jewish background. So people are deciding, you know, just because something was written thousands of years ago, we're not going to follow that anymore. We've been enlightened a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading an article on the damage associated with this in so many ways. And one of the things I was struck by, and I do want to ask you about it, clearly some of the more obvious damages come to the mind, right? You know, the shaming, the post-trauma. But the one thing I came across, which I didn't know, in an article I read, had to do with pain from the circumcision that alters the brain. And I looked at that, and I looked at a number of different research articles from that. And then I thought, of course, but boy, that alone should get people's attention, no?
Yeah, I mean, you would think so. You know, a number of organizations, I mean, the American Academy of Pediatrics said that, you know, exposure to painful stimuli early in life is known to have short and long-term consequences. You have to realize they take a baby that's just been born and they strap them down in this contraption, spread eagle, and they start basically tearing the foreskin off. Yeah. And they put this device on that crushes it. And it's like, it would be like getting your finger slammed shut in the car door, except we're going to keep the car door shut until the bleeding stops. The baby has to go through this for 15 minutes or longer. It's not, people think it's, you know, one of the funniest things we hear, not funny, it's kind of sad actually. They say, well, it's just a snip, like it's just over in a second, like it's clipping a fingernail. And it's not. It's a procedure that takes time, and it's done with little to no anesthesia, and the pain and the burning, it's like having a cut, a severe laceration, and that the baby has to deal with for days and days afterwards. And you know, circumcised babies often don't want to breastfeed, you know, because the pain and what was done to them is impacting them. Yeah,
you know, this kind of question is going to bring it full circle, I think, for us here, and I want to thank you for your time. One of the things that started the conversation here with us and really that got my attention was research that comes out. And it doesn't say a handful of the boys circumcised, right? Usually research will give you a statistic or they'll give you a number, and then you have to, you know, draw your own conclusion. But one of the things that multiple articles have said, and that majority of boys circumcised as children and adolescents meet diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, what we were talking about before. And so these studies that were done, and people always like to question this. They're like, well, how many people was that? Well, in one study, it was over 1,000 of them, right? And so we're looking at this, and we're looking at this being according to a rating scale. And so when you see that a majority of these boys met the full diagnostic criteria, right? So there's a full diagnostic criteria, but then there's also other subcategories. But over half met this criteria. We still don't know the longer term impacts of this. But what could we say about post-traumatic stress disorder that gets untreated? Because you and I both know about that. let's talk about that. Because if you don't know that's what you have, and you're not sure that this is the reason for it, you're not going to seek any help. And so how does the accumulation of this trauma, how does this accumulation over a lifetime, how does it add up? And then what is the end game for these folks in even getting help?
Well, I mean, some men are very affected by this. They have to seek counseling to help them deal with the feelings and what was done to them. You know, like I said, I know a couple of young men that took their own life over this because that was an easier way out for them than dealing with these problems. And it's not only PTSD. I mean, there was a study out of the University of Sheffield that found the stress of circumcision increases the rates of SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome in baby boys. And it's another stressor that's added on to a young infant's life that for some babies, they can't. That's just like the straw that breaks the camel's back. That's the last thing. And it could affect their breathing when they're sleeping and other issues. And circumcised babies have a higher SIDS rate. So it's the SIDS, it's the PTSD. These are all indicators that circumcision is causing some real emotional, psychological harm to our children.
I would be remiss if I didn't make a comment and have you comment on the role of the CDC in here, Center for Disease Control, because, I mean, this would not be the only time they don't get something right? They do a lot of great things. But, the question mark is, since these studies have been done, right, have you, your organization, have you made any leeway with the CDC?
It's an interesting question. I think it was around 2014, the CDC was preparing to issue a policy statement recommending infant circumcision for health benefits. And they put their policy out for public comment, and they got slammed. The public comments were overwhelmingly against it. And then I know there was one medical researcher that was able to prove that their evidence was junk science, and they shelved their policy statement. So they had to backtrack. They were out there to promote this. They thought it was a good idea, and they had to backtrack on it. And again, 22 medical associations around the world specifically say there are no medical benefits for circumcision. They do not. Canadian Pediatric Society does not recommend infant circumcision. Most of medical associations around the world, if they have a policy statement, they say it's not necessary. But our CDC, they went off on a weird track for some reason, but then they had to cancel it.
Yeah. And they certainly have done that with Lyme disease. So that's just one other example. But you've done a great job on your website by sitting down, and I love what you've done, where you outline 10 common myths, meaning like these are not true about circumcision, right? And you outline them so beautifully. But one of the things I think that we don't know if we don't read this is the fact that people actually believe these things, right? Like the fact that everyone is circumcised. There's a belief to about 20% of the population, or some large percent of the population may believe that, right? And,
right.
There are so many things we don't really know about. This is really part of your effort to get the word out, right? Our job is to educate people about this. We have people that support us, other people that believe in this, but maybe they don't have time to get involved, so they leave it to us to do that, and they support us. They give us donations. I love doing this because I know that what we're doing is right. And, any type of advocacy work, it's difficult to get people to change their minds because they want to defend what they did in the past. That's one of the challenges. But when we do events, I have parents come up to me and thank us. They said, I needed this information. I'm having a baby, or my friend is having a baby, or I need to convince a spouse that we don't need to do this.
we get so much great feedback from the public that it makes it all worthwhile.
Anthony, I want to thank you very much. Last question for you before we go to break. I want to know what your personal message is. And again, please give out your website for folks today. Thanks for joining me.
Sure. Our website is intaction.org. That's INTACTION.org. And my message is that circumcision is not necessary for babies. We need people to spread the word and to do their research. If not from our organization, there's a lot of information on the web and in social media. And if you have someone having a baby, especially a baby boy, tell them to research it, because you don't want to wait to the last minute after you deliver and then the obstetrician comes into the room and says, are we doing a circumcision or not? And they're going to push parents to do it. So you have to have the information before you get there.
Absolutely. Anthony, thank you so much. Anthony Losquadro joining me here today. We're talking about 7 ways that circumcision damages your mental health. When you go to the website, there is lots of information, including some of the things we believe that are actually not true. Let's take a short break. When we come back, I'm going to do our Power Up wrap up today. We'll be right back.